At Thanksgiving, my dad announced, "We're not going to babysit your kids anymore." I said, "Seriously?" Then I stopped doing repairs in your house and left. Next day, my phone exploded. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a time for family, for good food, for a break from everything. Instead, it turned into a disaster. We were all gathered at my parents' new house, the one I had spent the last 2 months fixing up for them. They had asked me to do it, and I had agreed. New floors, plumbing repairs, repainting, electrical work. Every free hour I had, I was there covered in dust and sweat, making sure everything was perfect. Meanwhile, they sat comfortably in their apartment, waiting for the house to be ready. I didn't complain. They were my parents. Helping them was just the thing to do. In return, I had asked for only one thing: occasional babysitting. Not every day, not even every weekend, just when I needed it. My wife had passed away a few years ago, and I was doing my best to raise my children on my own. But sometimes I needed help. I thought it made sense, and they had always agreed. Until that night. We were in the middle of dinner when my dad put down his fork and said, "We're not going to babysit your kids anymore." At first I thought he was joking, but his face was serious. The table went quiet. Then he continued. He said they were tired, that my children were too much. And then came the worst part. He compared them to my sister's children. He said how well-behaved they were, how quiet, how easy. Unlike mine, apparently. I looked over at my sister. She didn't say a word, just sitting there smiling. Something inside me twisted. I had spent 2 months fixing up her house for free. They had never had to lift a finger. And now they were telling me that my children were some kind of burden to them, that they weren't good enough compared to my sisters. I took a deep breath and tried to keep it together. Then I said, "Really? Then I'll stop fixing your house." Silence. My dad just stared at me as if I had slapped him. My mom jumped in and tried to smooth things over. She started talking about how I didn't understand how hard it was for them, how they had done so much for me. She made it sound like I was forcing them to do unpaid work, when in fact, I had hardly asked them for anything. Before I could respond, some of our other relatives spoke up. They didn't like it. One of my aunts said it was ridiculous to talk about my children like that, especially in front of them. Another uncle pointed out how much I had already done for my parents, how I had basically saved them thousands of dollars in repairs. And my sister, still silent, just sitting there, soaking up the praise for her. Perfect. Kids. I stood up. "Thank you for a great Thanksgiving dinner." I said, "I'm really thankful for everything." Then I turned to my children and told them we were leaving. We grabbed our coats and walked to the car, leaving a table full of stunned faces. That night, my children asked me why their grandparents had said those things, why they kept comparing them to their cousins. I sighed and rubbed my face. The world isn't always fair, and sometimes grandparents aren't the nicest people. They looked at me, waiting for something more. So I made sure to say the most important thing. "But I love you both more than anything." I went to bed exhausted. I had no regrets, but it still hurt. The next morning, I woke up to 52 missed calls from my parents. When I saw 52 missed calls, my first thought was that something terrible had happened. My stomach sank. I immediately called my mom back, half expecting to hear about some kind of emergency. Instead, the second she picked up, she started talking as if I had personally set her house on fire. "John, you need to come over. Now." I frowned. "Why? What happened?" She dodged the question, just kept insisting that I come over. My dad got on the phone too, his tone tense, but controlled. "Just come, John. We need to talk." I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what this was about, but I also knew I had to go anyway. My kids still had some things at their place, and I didn't want to leave their stuff behind. So I told them I'd be there in an hour. When I walked into their apartment, I could immediately tell that things had not calmed down overnight. My mom was pacing, my dad was standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed, and my sister, who had apparently decided to get even more involved, was sitting on the couch like she was moderating a presidential debate. As soon as I closed the door behind me, it started. My mom jumped in first. "John, don't you think you overreacted?" I stared at her. "Overreacted?" My dad jumped in. "Look, we're sorry if we hurt your feelings. But you can't just refuse to finish the house because of this." I almost laughed. There it was. That was what this was really about. Not the family, not the kids. Just the house. I shook my head. "So let me get this straight. You call my kids a burden, say they're too much for you, compare them to my sister's kids in front of everyone, and now when I say I won't do the work you asked me to do for free, I'm the problem?" My mother put her hand to her chest, as if I had just deeply offended her. "That's not fair, John. We have done a lot for you. We took care of your kids for years." My sister finally spoke up. "Mom, Dad, you really shouldn't compare the kids like that." For the first time, my parents actually looked surprised. My mom blinked at her. "You don't think we were right?" My sister shrugged. "It's not about being right. You just shouldn't have said it in front of the kids. It's not okay." I have to admit, I didn't expect her to say that. She wasn't exactly defending me, but she wasn't taking her side either. But instead of backing down, my dad turned back to me. "John, we just want this to be over. You're not going to cut us off over something so small." I looked him dead in the eye. "Watch me." My mom gasped as if I had threatened to put her in a nursing home. My dad started to say something else, but I was done. I went to the closet, grabbed my kids' clothes, and headed for the door. And that's when my mom said it. "John, you're being selfish." I stopped. Me? Selfish? After 2 months of free labor, after bending over backwards to help them, after never complaining about all the times they needed something from me, I turn around. Selfish? You wanted to work on your house, but you won't even look after your own grandchildren? You want my time, my effort, my energy. But the second I need something, it's suddenly too much for you. My mother opened her mouth to respond, but I was done. "You don't have to babysit anymore. But I don't have to fix your house either." Then I walked out. That was just the beginning. Things got worse over the next few weeks. First, they tried to make me come back. Then they tried to guilt me. Then they begged, because now they had a real problem. Hiring professionals would cost them a fortune. And the more I ignored them, the more desperate they became. But then just when I thought they couldn't get any more manipulative, something else happened. And it changed everything. For the first few days after that fight, I ignored their calls. They texted. I ignored those too. Then came the guilt tripping. First, my mom tried the classic. "We're getting old, John. We won't be around forever." Speech. Then my dad sent me a long message about family loyalty and how I was being unreasonable over a small misunderstanding. Meanwhile, my sister stayed mostly quiet. I figured she was trying to stay out of it, but at least she had spoken up a little during the argument. Then, about a week after Thanksgiving, I got a message from my dad that actually made me laugh. "John, we forgive you. Can you come finish the house this weekend?" Forgive me? I didn't even reply. That's when they shifted strategies. At first, they tried bribing me. My mom called and said they'd start babysitting again if I finished the house. I told her no. Then my dad texted me that they'd consider helping with the kids if I came over to talk things out. I told him no. Then they sent my sister to try. She called me one night and started with small talk, asking about the kids. Then, casually, she said, maybe you should just finish the house. They're being stubborn, but it's probably easier if you just get it done. I laughed. So I do free labor, and in return, they insult my kids. And you think I'm the one who should back down? She hesitated. I mean, it's their house, John. They're just stuck in their ways. You know how they are. I do. That's why I'm not doing it. She sighed. Look, I get it, okay? But they're never going to admit they were wrong. They're our parents. That hit me. She knew they were wrong. She wasn't even trying to deny it. But she also knew they would never say it out loud. I told her I had to go and hung up. That night, I thought about everything. About how for years I had been doing things for them without asking for anything in return. About how they had never once shown me real appreciation. how they acted like it was my duty to help them, but an inconvenience to help me. And I decided I was done. Completely. That was the night I blocked their numbers. 2 days later, my sister showed up at my apartment. Unannounced. I opened the door and saw her standing there, looking uncomfortable. "We need to talk," she said. I let her in. She sat down at my kitchen table and just stared at me for a minute. Then she sighed. "They called a contractor." That surprised me. "Good. So they finally got someone to do it?" She winced. "Yeah, but there's a problem." I waited. "They got scammed." I blinked. "What?" She nodded. "Dad hired some guy off Facebook because he was cheaper than a real company. Paid him a front. And now he's gone. Took the money and disappeared." I couldn't help it. I laughed. My sister gave me a look. "John, they lost $10,000. I stopped laughing. 10 grand? Wait, where did they even get that much money? "They borrowed some of it," she said. "From family." That part caught me off guard. "Who?" She hesitated. Then she said, "Uncle Mark, Aunt Linda, even Grandma." I sat back. They had borrowed from multiple people just to avoid admitting they needed me. And now they were $10,000 in the hole with a half-finished house. I shook my head. "That's not my problem." My sister nodded slowly. "I know. And I told them that." That made me pause. "You what?" She sighed. "I told them they should have just apologized to you. That they did this to themselves." For the first time in this whole mess, I felt something shift. My sister, their favorite, their golden child, had actually stood up for me. She leaned forward. "John, they're desperate. They want you to come back. They're still being stubborn, but they know they messed up." I crossed my arms. "And," she shrugged, "and I think you should make them beg." Hearing my sister say that threw me off. She had always been the favorite, the one they praised, the one they defended. And now she was telling me to make them beg? I raised an eyebrow. "You really think they'll do that?" She gave me a half smile. "They don't have a choice." For the first time in forever, I felt like I had the upper hand. I leaned back in my chair. "So what exactly do they want from me?" She sighed. "They want you to come over and talk." I laughed. "Yeah, I've heard that before." She nodded. "I know. But this time, they're not in control. You are." And she was right. I didn't go that day. I didn't go the next day either. I let them sit in their mess. Let them sweat. A few days later, my mom broke. She sent a long, rambling text. Half apology, half excuse. She admitted that maybe they were unfair. That maybe they shouldn't have said what they said. But the funniest part? We should have handled things differently. But you also overreacted. I actually laughed when I read it. Even when they were desperate, they still had to throw in some blame. I ignored the message. Then my dad tried. His was shorter. "John, we need you. Come back and finish the house. We'll figure everything else out later." No apology. Just "we need you." Ignored. The next night, my sister called me. "Okay," she said. "I think they're actually breaking this time." "What happened?" "They told me to tell you they're sorry." I blinked. "Wait, they actually said that?" She hesitated. "Well, they told me to tell you." Not in those exact words, but I sighed. "Close enough." Then she said something that surprised me. "They asked me if I thought you'd ever speak to them again." That made me pause. For the first time, I realized they were actually scared. They weren't just worried about the house. They were worried they had pushed me too far. And honestly, they had. I agreed to meet them. Not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to hear it from them. I told my sister I'd come over, but on my terms. When I walked into their apartment, they looked different, less sure of themselves, more nervous. My mom had been crying. My dad looked exhausted. I sat down, crossed my arms, and waited. Finally, my dad sighed. "We messed up, John." That was the closest to an actual apology I was going to get. He went on about how they didn't mean to hurt me, that they were frustrated, tired, stressed, that the house had become overwhelming, that they said things they shouldn't have. Then my mom finally spoke. Her voice was quiet. "We love you, and we love the kids." And for the first time, I believed her. I let them sit in the silence for a moment. Then I said, I'm not finishing your house. My mom gasped like I had slapped her. My dad tensed. John, I cut him off. You had 2 months of free labor from me. You had help whenever you needed it. And the one thing I asked for in return was too much for you. Now I'm done. I'm not angry anymore. But I'm not fixing your house. Silence. My mom looked like she wanted to argue. But she didn't. My dad looked at the table. My sister? She just watched. Then I stood up. But I'm willing to move forward. If you stop treating me like I owe you something. If you stop treating my kids like they're less than my sisters. And if you understand that from now on, if I help you, it's because I want to, not because you expect it. They nodded, because they had no other choice. I left that day knowing I had won. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. After that meeting, things weren't magically fixed. My parents weren't suddenly better people. And I wasn't naive enough to think they wouldn't try to push boundaries again. But something had changed. They knew now that I wasn't going to be their handyman, their backup plan, their safety net. They knew I was ready to walk away, and that scared them. For a few weeks, it was quiet. No unnecessary phone calls, no guilt trips, just silence. It was almost peaceful. Then one afternoon, I got a text from my mom. Can we take the kids this weekend? We missed them. I stared at the text for a while. This was the same woman who had called her a burden. The same one who had compared them to my sister's children in front of them. Now, she suddenly missed them? I wanted to ignore it, but I thought of my children. So I asked her, do you want to go? They hesitated. My youngest, Ben, looked uncertain. My oldest, Emily, crossed her arms. Are they going to be weird again? I was honest. Maybe. They thought about it. Then Emily shrugged. I guess we can go. So I sent a quick reply. Sure. I'll drop her off at 5. That weekend when I dropped her off, my parents were different. My mom was overly nice, like she was trying too hard to prove she wasn't the bad guy. My dad was quiet. I stayed for a few minutes, just long enough to make sure my kids were comfortable. Then, before I left, my dad pulled me aside. We really love them, John. He said, we just messed up. It wasn't a full apology. But for my dad, it was as close as I was ever going to get. I just nodded. Good. Then don't mess up again. Later that night, I got a call from my sister. I have to tell you something, she said. I could hear in her voice that it was serious. What is it? She sighed. Mom told me something the other day about why she stopped babysitting. I sat up. Because they were tired, right? She hesitated. Then she said, no, that wasn't it. At least, not the whole reason. I frowned. What was it then? She took a deep breath. You were jealous, John. I blinked. Jealous? Of what? She hesitated. Of you? Of how much the family stood by you at Thanksgiving. Of how close you are with your children. About how you became the center of attention when they're used to it being me. That completely threw me. That doesn't even make sense. It does to them. She said, you felt like you lost control. Like people were looking at you as the good son, the responsible one. And that pissed them off. I sat there trying to process this. My parents weren't just tired of babysitting. They were bitter. Bitter that I was a good father. It was crazy. It was sad. And it only confirmed one thing for me. They were never really going to change. I didn't tell my parents what my sister said. It wouldn't have changed anything. But I did change the way I treated them. From then on, everything was on my terms. When I wanted to see the children, only if my children wanted to. If they wanted my help with something, they had to ask, not expect. If they ever disrespected my children again, that was it. No second chances. And the best part? They knew. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just their son. I was someone they had to respect. And that was worth everything. For a while, things stayed civil. My parents were on their best behavior. They didn't push. They didn't guilt me. And they didn't ask me for help around the house anymore. It was almost as if they had finally learned. Until they hadn't. One Sunday afternoon, my aunt called me. John, did you see what your mom posted on Facebook? That was never a good line to hear. I'd open the app, and there was a long, dramatic post from my mom about how families should always help each other, and how some people forget where they came from. And after all we've done, it's sad to see our own son turn his back on us. She didn't say my name, but everybody knew who she was talking about. And the best part? She ended it with, "At least we still have our amazing daughter who never left us." That was it. That was the moment I was done. I didn't text her. I didn't call her. I commented directly on the post. "You're right, Mom. Families should help each other. That's why I spent 2 months fixing your house for free while you sat in your apartment. That's why I asked for nothing in return except that you treat my kids with basic respect. And when you called them a burden and compared them to my sister's children, I realized that you don't want family. You want servants. And I'm not playing that role anymore." I hit send, and then I watched the floodgates open. The first comment was from my uncle. "Wow, I didn't know the whole story. This is messed up." Then my aunt. "John is right. You took advantage of him. He gave you everything, and you repaid him by insulting his children? Unbelievable." Then my grandmother, the one they borrowed money from. "You told me you needed the money because John refused to help you. But you never told me why. Now I see the truth." Comment after comment took my side. And then the best one came from my sister. "I love Mom and Dad, but John is telling the truth. They treated him unfairly, and he has every right to leave." My golden sister, the one they always favored, the one they always supported, and even she didn't defend them. I sat back and watched my parents' reputations plummet in real time. Then, about an hour later, the post was deleted. My mom tried to call. I didn't answer. Then she texted, "Was that necessary?" I replied, "Was your mail necessary?" Silence. A few days later, my father finally gave in. He sent a message. "We were wrong. We're sorry. No excuses. No blame. Just those words." And honestly, I didn't need anything else. I never worked on their house again. They had to hire someone at full price. I never let them guilt me into anything again. If they wanted to see my kids, it was because my kids wanted to see them, not because they demanded it. And the biggest change? They never, ever compare my kids to my sister's kids again, because they knew if they did, it would be the last time they ever saw her. I had put them in their place, and for the first time, they got it. I had won.